The busy streets of downtown Palo Alto buzzed with activity. The sound of honking cars and footsteps echoed through the city as people hurried to their next destinations. Tesla's headquarters stood tall, its sleek glass exterior reflecting the California sun. At the entrance, a man stood with a cardboard sign in his hands, his clothes worn and his face weathered by years of hardship. His name was John, and he had been living on the streets for months. His only request, written on the sign, was simple. "Can you spare $1?" John had been out here for hours, trying to collect enough for a meal. He wasn't asking for much, just enough to get by, to survive another day. He'd been trying to get back on his feet for so long, but the world around him seemed to keep pushing him down. People passed by, some ignoring him, some offering a brief glance of sympathy, but no one stopped. Not until today. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? A black Tesla Model S pulled up near the entrance of the building. The driver's door opened, and a tall man in a suit stepped out. His face was instantly recognizable. Elon Musk, the billionaire entrepreneur and CEO of Tesla, SpaceX, and countless other ventures. He was a man who had changed the world, a genius with a reputation for taking on the impossible. The crowd around John didn't notice at first. They were too focused on their own busy lives. But as Elon took a few steps towards the building, his gaze fell on John standing there, holding his sign. For a moment, time seemed to slow down. John's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Could this be the break he had been waiting for? Elon Musk was standing right there, just a few feet away. His mind raced. Should he ask for money? Should he try to speak to him? The thought of approaching someone like Elon was almost laughable. Yet here he was, in the middle of the chaos, with the chance of a lifetime standing right in front of him. The moment stretched on as John gathered his courage. With shaking hands, he stepped forward and held up his sign. "Can you spare $1?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The crowd watched, some with curious eyes, others with skepticism. What would Elon Musk do? Would he ignore the man and walk inside? Or would he stop and help, even just a little? Elon Musk slowed his pace, coming to a stop right in front of John. The two men locked eyes for a brief moment. John could see the wheels turning in Elon's mind, but there was no telling what the billionaire would do. The tension in the air was palpable. People around them held their breath, wondering if they were about to witness something extraordinary, or if this was just another moment in a world where the rich and the poor never truly met. Elon took a step back, not turning to walk away, but simply standing there, looking at John. The moment seemed to stretch on forever. John's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea what was going through Elon's mind, but he knew this was a pivotal moment. He could feel the weight of it. Then, to John's surprise, Elon smiled, not an expression of pity, but something more genuine. His eyes softened as if he were seeing more than just a man on the street asking for change. "Why just $1?" Elon asked, his voice calm and thoughtful. John blinked, taken aback by the question. He had expected a simple rejection or a cold, dismissive response. Instead, Elon was asking a question, engaging him. John, still unsure how to respond, took a deep breath. "Just enough to eat," John replied, his voice quieter now, as if the vulnerability of the moment had finally hit him. Elon nodded slowly, his expression serious. "All right then," he said, his tone still measured, but there was something more behind his words. "Come with me." For a second, John thought he had misheard him. Was Elon Musk really asking him to come with him? To leave the street, leave his cardboard sign, and walk with him? The crowd stood still, whispering among themselves. Some faces were full of disbelief, others unsure how to react. John, unsure whether this was real or just another one of those cruel tricks the universe liked to play on him, hesitated. But then something inside him stirred. A spark of hope, the faintest glimmer of belief that maybe, just maybe, his life could change. He nodded and followed Elon as they walked toward the entrance of Tesla's headquarters. "Where are we going?" John asked, still trying to make sense of the situation. "To talk," Elon said. "I'm curious about your story." The doors to Tesla's headquarters swung open with a quiet hum. and John followed Elon through the modern, minimalist lobby. It was a world apart from the gritty, chaotic streets he was used to. The sleek, high-tech design felt like something out of a futuristic movie, with bright white walls, polished floors, and bold art pieces that screamed luxury. John felt out of place, his worn jacket and scuffed shoes making him stand out like a sore thumb. Elon led him to a small, quiet lounge area, tucked away from the bustling offices. A large window framed a breathtaking view of the city, but John barely noticed. He was still trying to process what was happening. He hadn't even asked for much, just $1. But here he was, sitting across from one of the wealthiest and most influential people in the world. Elon sat across from him, leaning forward with his hands clasped in front of him, a thoughtful expression on his face. "So, tell me your story. How did you end up out there on the street?" John shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes dropping to the table. The question was innocent enough, but it felt like a heavy weight. It wasn't easy to talk about his past, especially to someone like Elon. But there was something in Elon's tone, something genuine, that made John feel like maybe, just maybe, he could share the truth. John let out a long sigh before beginning, his voice shaky at first. "I wasn't always like this," he started. "I used to have a good job, a family, a life that seemed like it was going places." Elon nodded, waiting patiently for John to continue. "I was an engineer. I worked at a tech company, a startup. I thought it was my big break. But one thing led to another. The market crashed, the company folded, and I lost everything. My job, my home, my wife, everything," John said, his voice cracking as he remembered those dark days. He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I tried to bounce back. I got some freelance work, but it wasn't enough. I couldn't pay the bills. My wife left. She took the kids. And eventually, I ended up on the streets. It's like, one moment, I was on top of the world, and the next, I was invisible." There was a long silence as John's words hung in the air. Elon didn't interrupt, just listened, his eyes locked onto John, as if he were trying to understand the depths of his pain. "Do you ever think about going back?" Elon asked after a moment, his voice low but steady. John shook his head. "I wish I could. I wish I could just get back on my feet. But it feels like every time I try, something knocks me down again. It's like the harder I fight, the more the world just pushes me away." Elon sat back in his chair, a faint furrow in his brow. It was clear he was thinking deeply about what John had just shared. But it wasn't pity that crossed his face. It was something else, something far more complicated, maybe even empathetic. Elon had his own set of challenges, his own set of scars, despite his immense success. It wasn't just money that weighed on him. It was the constant pressure, the risk, the burden of trying to change the world. "I get that," Elon said finally, his voice calm but carrying a weight of its own. "You know, I didn't exactly start out in the best position either. I've had my share of failures, too. There was a time when I was struggling to make rent, even though I was working 20-hour days. The first few startups I worked on were, well, let's just say they didn't go as planned." John raised an eyebrow. "You?" Elon chuckled, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, it's easy to forget, but I wasn't always the guy who made it big. The first company I founded almost failed because I couldn't convince anyone to invest. I was living in a tiny apartment, scraping by." John looked at him, disbelief in his eyes. "I can't even imagine you struggling like that. You're Elon Musk." Elon shrugged, a half-smile still on his face. "People think that success is a straight line. It's not. There were a lot of sleepless nights, a lot of people telling me I was crazy, a lot of mistakes. The difference is, I kept trying. I didn't let failure define me. And eventually, things started to turn around." John shifted uncomfortably in his chair, feeling a mix of awe and skepticism. "But you had the money to back you up. You had the support. You didn't have to fight for every penny." Elon's expression softened. "True, but that doesn't mean it was easy. In fact, the pressure was unbearable at times. But the key is to keep pushing forward. To look at failure not as the end, but as the beginning of something new." John couldn't help but feel a little hopeful. Elon's words, though simple, carried an undeniable weight. It wasn't just talk. It was the philosophy that had led him to create Tesla, SpaceX, and change entire industries. But for John, it wasn't enough to just hear words. He needed action. He needed to believe that there was still a chance for him to turn things around. "I don't know if I can do it," John said softly, staring at his hands, his voice filled with doubt. "I'm not like you." Elon leaned forward again, his gaze unwavering. "That's the thing, John. You don't have to be like me. You have to be like you. You've got the same potential. You just need the right opportunities. And sometimes, all it takes is one person to give you that chance." The sun was beginning to dip low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the Tesla campus as John and Elon sat in the quiet lounge, the air between them thick with unspoken thoughts. John could feel the weight of Elon's words lingering, settling in his mind, but doubts crept in. It felt like the world was offering him a chance, but he wasn't sure he could take it. "So, what now?" John asked, his voice a little shaky. "I mean, you've heard my story. But what about you? What makes you willing to help someone like me?" Elon leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the skyline. His fingers drummed lightly on the surface of the table, as if he were thinking carefully about his response. "I don't know. I guess I see a little bit of myself in you," he said, his tone steady but thoughtful. "I've always been a problem solver, even when the problems seemed too big. People told me I was crazy, especially when I started SpaceX and Tesla. They said it was impossible, but I believed there was a way." John stared at him, processing the words. "So, you think I can find a way to?" Elon's gaze softened. "It's not about finding the way. It's about being willing to keep looking for it, no matter how hard it gets. The world won't give you the answers you want. You have to create your own answers. And sometimes that means taking risks." John felt a strange mixture of hope and terror at those words. Risks. He had been taking risks his entire life, just not the right kind. His past decisions had led him down a dark path, and it seemed like the stakes were always too high. But hearing Elon Musk, someone who had built an empire from the ground up, say that risk was part of the process made it seem less terrifying. "What kind of risk are you talking about?" John asked, his voice quieter now. Elon paused, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. He wasn't just talking about business anymore. He was speaking to something deeper. "It's about betting on yourself. When I was your age, I was in a much worse spot than you are now. I barely had enough money to get by. But I didn't let that stop me. I invested everything I had, my time, my energy, my money, into things I believed in, even when everyone thought I was crazy." John ran his hands through his hair, feeling the weight of the conversation press against his chest. He wasn't sure he could ever be that kind of person, the kind of person who took risks when failure seemed inevitable. But something in Elon's voice, something in his confidence, made it hard to ignore the possibility. "Look, I don't know if I can handle the kind of pressure you've been through," John admitted, his voice cracking a little. "I don't even know if I can trust myself anymore. Every time I try to do something right, it falls apart. I'm not a CEO. I'm just a guy who's messed up everything." Elon's eyes softened, and for the first time, John saw a hint of something more than business acumen in his face. "I wasn't a CEO when I started either. I was just a guy with a lot of ideas and a belief that I could make a difference. But the truth is, no one has all the answers. And no one is perfect. The difference between those who succeed and those who don't is simple. The ones who succeed keep going when it gets tough. They don't quit." The words hit John harder than expected. It was something he'd heard before, but hearing it from someone who had actually lived through failure and come out on top struck a chord. He didn't feel ready to face the world again. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. "But what if I fail again?" John asked quietly. Elon leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "Failure isn't the opposite of success. It's a part of it. You only fail when you stop trying." John was silent for a long time, trying to process what Elon was telling him. The idea of failure no longer feeling like the end, of failure being a lesson instead of a roadblock, was something he hadn't considered before. It was almost freeing. But was he brave enough to believe it? There was a long pause. John stared at the table, then back at Elon. "So, what's your offer?" I mean, I can't just live off your charity. I don't want to be that guy. Elon's lips curled into a small smile, but there was no mockery in it, only understanding. I'm not offering charity, he said firmly. I'm offering you a chance to prove to yourself that you're capable of more. There's a spot for you in one of Tesla's entry-level programs. It's not glamorous, but it's a start. It's a way to show you what you're made of. John's heart skipped a beat. A job at Tesla? The thought seemed impossible, but it was also something he couldn't ignore. Could this really be his chance? He'd never been good at working for someone else, never been good at fitting into the system. But the way Elon spoke, like he believed in John, was something he had never felt before. I don't know what to say, John muttered. It sounds too good to be true. It's real, Elon said with a quiet confidence. You can start tomorrow. The program is intense, and you'll have to prove yourself. But I'm willing to give you a shot. John's mind raced, torn between disbelief and hope. A job at Tesla. It was a far cry from begging on the street, and yet it felt so distant. But as he sat across from Elon, something inside him stirred, a sense of possibility he hadn't felt in years. I'll do it, he said, his voice steady for the first time in a long while. I'll take the risk. I'll prove I can do it. Elon smiled, standing up and offering his hand. That's the spirit. Welcome to Tesla, John. Let's see what you've got. John reached out and shook Elon's hand, feeling a jolt of energy surge through him. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. He wasn't sure where this would take him, but for the first time in years, he had a reason to believe in himself again. He had something to prove. The next morning, John stood outside Tesla's headquarters, his heart racing with a mixture of excitement and fear. He'd barely slept the night before, his mind buzzing with thoughts of what the future might hold. Could he really do this? Could he prove himself worthy of the chance Elon Musk had just given him? He checked his watch. It was early, and the campus was still relatively quiet. A few employees were walking toward the entrance, briefcases in hand, chatting with one another. John felt out of place in his worn-out jacket, but he didn't have the luxury of time to worry about appearances. This was his moment, and he had to seize it. As he walked through the front doors, the reality of the situation hit him all over again. He was inside Tesla, a place where the brightest minds in technology and innovation worked. He'd seen the products, admired the sleek designs, and marveled at the advancements. But now he was part of it, and that thought both thrilled and terrified him. Inside, the lobby was full of energy. People hustled between rooms, phones pressed to their ears, voices echoing in the vast space. John tried to keep his head down, not wanting to attract too much attention. He wasn't sure where he was supposed to go. But then, a man in a sharp suit approached him. You must be John, the man said with a friendly but professional smile. I'm Matt. I'll be your guide today. John offered a shaky smile in return. Yeah, that's me. Matt led him through the sleek hallways, past high-tech displays and offices filled with people typing away at their computers. The environment was intimidating, but at the same time, John couldn't help but be impressed. Tesla was a world apart from the life he had left behind. You're here for the entry-level program, right? Matt asked as they walked. John nodded. Yeah, I'm here to prove myself. Matt gave him an encouraging look. Good attitude. That's what you'll need here. The program is intense, and it's not for everyone. But if you're serious, you can make it. John swallowed hard, his nerves getting the best of him. I'll do my best. They arrived at a conference room, where several other new recruits were already gathered. They were mostly younger, fresh-faced college graduates eager to start their careers. John felt like an outsider among them, unsure of what he was doing there. He'd spent years living on the streets, fighting to survive. They had degrees, experience, connections. He had none of that. As they all took their seats, the door at the front of the room opened, and a tall woman walked in. She had sharp features, short black hair, and an air of authority that commanded attention. She introduced herself as Sarah, the program manager. Good morning, everyone, Sarah began, her voice confident and direct. Welcome to the Tesla entry-level program. I'm sure you're all eager to get started, but let me be clear. This program is not a walk in the park. It's designed to push you to your limits, to challenge everything you think you know about work, about yourself. If you're here to coast, leave now. John's stomach churned. He had been through plenty of tough times, but this felt different. He couldn't just walk away. Not now. Not after everything he had gone through to get here. Sarah continued, outlining the program's goals and expectations. It was a mix of hands-on work, problem-solving tasks, and team collaboration. Everyone was expected to learn quickly, contribute meaningfully, and demonstrate initiative. The challenges would come fast, and they would come hard. You'll be tested every day, Sarah said, on your ability to think critically, to solve problems, and to push through when it gets tough. There are no handouts here. Your performance will decide your future with Tesla. John clenched his fists under the table, trying to steady his nerves. This was the moment of truth. If he couldn't handle the pressure here, he would lose the only chance he'd ever get. The thought made his heart race, but it also filled him with a sense of urgency. He couldn't afford to fail. Sarah finished her briefing and handed out assignments. John's task was straightforward enough. He was to assist with a small project on the assembly line, helping to troubleshoot a production issue with one of Tesla's new models. It sounded simple at first, but John knew better than to underestimate anything in a place like this. He was paired with a young man named Jake, who looked no older than 25. Jake was friendly, eager to get started, and seemed genuinely excited to be part of the team. But John noticed something right away. Jake's confidence was different from his own. Jake had been trained for this. John, on the other hand, had only his instincts and the grit that had kept him alive on the streets. As they walked to the assembly line, John felt his anxiety creep up again. This wasn't just about working with machinery. It was about proving that he could keep up, that he could handle the fast-paced, high-stakes environment of Tesla. The world he had come from didn't prepare him for this. The assembly line was a hive of activity, with workers moving quickly and efficiently, their hands a blur as they put together car parts with precision. John tried to keep up, but the speed and complexity of the work overwhelmed him. Jake showed him the basics, how to monitor the machine settings, troubleshoot minor glitches, and keep the line moving smoothly. But every time John made a mistake, he could feel the eyes of the others on him, judging him, doubting him. After an hour, John felt completely out of his depth. He had no technical training, no experience in a high-pressure environment like this. And every time he messed up, his confidence took another hit. Jake, though patient, could tell John was struggling. He tried to offer tips and encouragement, but it didn't feel like enough. "I don't know if I can do this," John muttered under his breath as they tried to fix an issue with one of the machines. Jake glanced at him, his face serious. "Hey, you've got this. Just keep pushing. Don't back down." But John wasn't so sure. The pressure was mounting. If he couldn't get this right, he would fail, and that would be it. The chance Elon had given him would slip through his fingers, just like everything else in his life. By the end of the second day, John felt like he was drowning. Every time he thought he had a handle on the task at hand, something new came up, some new challenge that he couldn't quite wrap his head around. It was as if every piece of knowledge, every skill he needed, was just beyond his reach. The other recruits moved through their tasks with an ease that left John feeling like a failure. He had never been one to ask for help, but in this environment, it seemed like an unforgivable weakness. His pride, the same pride that had kept him alive on the streets, was no match for the cold, calculated efficiency of Tesla's workforce. Jake had been trying to help, offering tips here and there, but John couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding everyone back. By the end of the second day, he was exhausted, physically, emotionally, mentally. His hands ached from the machines, his head throbbed with frustration, and the weight of the fear that he would never be good enough was crushing him. Late in the afternoon, he sat in the break room, staring at his hands, willing them to stop shaking. Around him, the other employees were relaxed, chatting about their day, laughing as they sipped on their coffee. It seemed so easy for them, so effortless. John's mind was racing, but all he could focus on was the hollow feeling in his chest. He wasn't cut out for this. He didn't belong here. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "You okay?" Jake asked, standing in the doorway, looking concerned. John didn't immediately respond. He wasn't sure what to say. Should he tell Jake how he was feeling? That he felt completely out of his depth, That he couldn't seem to do anything right? That every minute here felt like a test he was bound to fail? But John didn't say anything. Instead, he stood up, grabbed his coffee, and forced a smile. Yeah, just tired. It's been a long day. Jake studied him for a moment before stepping into the room. You know, John, you don't have to do this alone. It's okay to ask for help. We're all here to learn together. John's chest tightened at the offer. He had spent so long fighting alone, surviving alone. Asking for help had always felt like a weakness, like admitting he wasn't enough. But something about Jake's words made him reconsider. I'm not used to this, John finally admitted, his voice low, as if saying it out loud might make it real. I don't know if I can keep up with this pace. I don't know if I'm cut out for this kind of work. This isn't like the streets, Jake. I can't just hustle my way through it. Jake took a seat next to him, his face softening. I get it. This is a whole different world from what you're used to. But you're here for a reason, John. Elon saw something in you. He believes you have what it takes. And so do I. John's chest tightened even further at the mention of Elon. Elon Musk. The man who had given him a chance, a lifeline. The same man who had taken risks in his own life, who had built empires. And here John was, on the verge of throwing it all away because he couldn't even figure out how to fix a malfunctioning machine. What if I don't have what it takes? John muttered, staring into his coffee cup. What if this was just a mistake? What if Elon was wrong about me? Jake's eyes grew more serious. No one is perfect. Everyone has moments where they doubt themselves. The difference between those who make it and those who don't is whether they keep going when it feels impossible. You're not going to figure everything out overnight. Hell, no one expects you to. But you have to trust that you can learn. That's all we're doing here, learning and adapting. John felt the weight of those words sink in. Trust. He hadn't trusted anyone in a long time, especially not himself. But maybe that's where the change had to start. Maybe it wasn't about being perfect. Maybe it was just about pushing forward, no matter how many times he stumbled. Yeah, I guess I can try that, John said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake smiled, clapping him on the back. That's all anyone can ask for. Just keep showing up. John wasn't sure if he could do it, but Jake's words stayed with him as he left the break room. He still didn't have all the answers. He didn't even know if he was capable of succeeding in this new world. But for the first time since he walked through those doors, he realized that maybe the most important thing was simply to try. The next morning, John walked into Tesla with a renewed sense of purpose. The fear was still there, lurking in the back of his mind. But now there was something else, something unfamiliar. Hope. He had nothing to lose but everything to gain. The day began like the last two, with tasks that seemed insurmountable. Machines malfunctioned, problems arose, and once again, John felt like he was stumbling through it all. But this time, he didn't freeze. When he didn't know what to do, he asked for help. When he made a mistake, he owned it and fixed it. And when he felt like giving up, he reminded himself why he was there. He wasn't just working at Tesla. He was working toward his future. By the end of the day, John didn't feel like a complete failure anymore. The pressure was still immense, and there was still a long way to go. But he had taken the first step toward proving to himself that he could make it. Elon had given him a chance, and he wasn't about to waste it. Not this time. The following days were a blur of confusion and exhaustion. John had settled into a rhythm, though it was far from comfortable. Every morning, he walked into Tesla with a knot in his stomach, hoping today wouldn't be the day he completely failed. But each time, he found himself pushing through, a little bit stronger than the day before. It wasn't easy. The tasks were still complicated, and he still felt like he was constantly playing catch-up. But the fear that had paralyzed him in the beginning had started to recede, replaced by something else, a sense of quiet determination. With each mistake, he learned something new. With each failure, he grew stronger. By the end of the week, John had finally started to feel like he was making progress. He wasn't perfect, not by any means, but he was no longer the newcomer who was too scared to ask for help. He was a part of the team, contributing to the work, even if it was just in small ways. One particular moment stood out to him. They were working on a new model of the Tesla Model 3, and there was a glitch in the assembly line that had thrown off the entire production schedule. The problem was complex, something John had never seen before, and the whole team was stumped. Jake, as always, was quick to jump in, his fingers moving over the machines with practiced ease. But this time, John noticed something. There was a small, seemingly insignificant part of the machine that no one had checked, an old sensor that hadn't been calibrated correctly. Everyone was so focused on the bigger issues that they overlooked this tiny detail. John hesitated, unsure if his hunch was right. But with the pressure mounting and the hours ticking by, he decided to speak up. "Hey, what if we check the sensor?" he suggested, his voice tentative. "It's old, and maybe it just needs recalibration." Jake paused, looked at him for a second, then shrugged. "It's a long shot, but it's worth a try." John didn't know why he felt so sure, but the sensor issue had been nagging at him since he first saw the setup. The team made their way over, and sure enough, after recalibrating the sensor, the glitch was fixed. The line resumed running smoothly, and the production delay was minimized. The moment the problem was solved, John felt a rush of adrenaline. It wasn't just that he'd fixed something. It was that, for the first time, he had contributed meaningfully to the team. He'd been the one to notice something no one else had. It was a small victory, but it was his. Jake slapped him on the back, grinning. "Nice catch, man. That's the kind of thing we need more of around here." John felt a warmth spread through him, the first spark of pride in a long time. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him believe that maybe, just maybe, he belonged here. The next day, Elon Musk made an unexpected appearance at the Tesla factory. John had heard rumors that Elon would be visiting soon, but he hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. The staff was buzzing with excitement, and the atmosphere in the building felt charged with energy. John, however, couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't ready to face the man who had given him this opportunity. What would he think of John's progress? Would he see through the cracks in John's confidence? Elon walked through the assembly line with a group of senior engineers, listening intently as they explained their work and the challenges they faced. His presence was magnetic, quiet, but powerful. His mind seemed to be moving at 1,000 miles per hour as he absorbed everything around him, his eyes scanning every machine, every process, every person. John stood in the background, trying to stay out of sight, but he couldn't help but watch. Elon Musk was a living legend. He had built some of the most innovative companies in the world, and now here he was, walking through the same space where John was struggling to make a name for himself. As Elon made his way past John's station, their eyes briefly met. John felt his heart leap into his throat. Elon didn't say anything, but there was something in his gaze, a silent acknowledgement that John was there, working, trying. For the rest of the day, John couldn't shake the feeling that he had somehow passed some invisible test. It wasn't that Elon had spoken to him or praised him, but the look they exchanged seemed to imply something deeper, a sense of understanding. That night, John lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the day over and over. It wasn't a major breakthrough. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a step forward. He had fixed a problem, had contributed to the team, and had made an impression on Elon without even saying a word. The thought made him smile. Maybe he could do this after all. The days after the small victory felt like a new chapter for John. He was still far from being an expert, but there was a noticeable shift in his mindset. He wasn't just showing up anymore. He was participating. Every time he walked onto the Tesla campus, he felt a little more grounded, a little more certain of his place in this high-tech world. There was still a long way to go, but now John was starting to believe that he could make it. But as with any journey, just when things seemed to stabilize, a new challenge arose. It came without warning, a test that threatened to unravel everything he had worked for. It was a Friday morning when Sarah, the program manager, called him into her office. Her expression was unreadable, making John's nerves spike instantly. He had been doing his work, hadn't messed up, hadn't done anything to draw negative attention to himself. But Sarah's stern look suggested otherwise. "John," she began, "we've been monitoring your progress over the past week. You've shown improvement, and that's good. But there's a problem." John felt his throat tighten, his stomach dropping. "What's the problem?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "The program is about more than just technical skills. We need to see that you can adapt to the fast pace, that you can work independently under pressure. You're still relying too much on others to guide you through your tasks. John opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The truth stung. It was true. He had been leaning on Jake for help, asking for advice when things got tough. But he had thought it was okay. Wasn't that what teammates were for? I'm not saying you're failing, Sarah continued, her tone softening slightly, but I need to see that you can step up on your own. It's time for you to take on a more independent project. No help, no hand-holding. If you can handle it, you'll prove to me and to yourself that you belong here. If not, well, this program might not be the right fit for you. John's chest constricted. The weight of her words felt like a heavy stone settling on his ribs. He had come so far. He couldn't let this be the thing that took him down. But how could he manage this on his own? I'll do it, John finally said, his voice a little shaky but determined. I'll prove I can handle it. Sarah nodded. Good. We'll see how you perform. You'll be assigned a project involving the assembly line's optimization. It's not a small task, but I think it's the right step for you. The next few hours passed in a blur as John struggled to wrap his mind around the enormity of the challenge. He was being given a chance to prove himself, but this time, there was no safety net. No Jake to guide him through it. No one to back him up when he made mistakes. The assignment was simple in theory. Identify areas where the assembly line could be made more efficient. Find the bottlenecks, the places where production slowed down, and come up with a solution to fix them. Easy, right? Except it wasn't. The assembly line was a well-oiled machine, and any changes, no matter how small, had ripple effects throughout the entire process. John knew the pressure was on. One wrong move, and everything could grind to a halt. And worse, he would lose everything he had worked for. The chance that Elon had given him, the progress he had made, everything. John spent the next 2 hours studying the assembly line, walking the length of it, watching how the workers moved, how the machines hummed along. He tried to look for any inefficiencies, any issues that he could improve. But everything seemed to be running smoothly. The line was fast, precise, and efficient. Where could he possibly make a difference? Frustration started to creep in. Maybe Sarah had been right. Maybe he wasn't cut out for this. Maybe there was nothing for him to fix, and he was just wasting everyone's time. That's when he heard a voice behind him. Need a hand? John turned to find Jake standing there, a concerned expression on his face. I'm not supposed to ask for help, John muttered, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Sarah said I need to do this on my own. Jake nodded, understanding. Yeah, but I'm not here to give you answers. I'm just here to listen. You look like you're hitting a wall. John looked down at his feet, unsure of what to say. He felt torn. He didn't want to fail, but he also didn't want to let Jake down by admitting he couldn't do this. Jake had always been there for him, offering advice, encouragement. But this was different. I don't know where to start, John admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The line's running fine. I don't see any obvious problems. Jake thought for a moment. You've been looking at the big picture. Maybe it's time to zoom in a little. Look at the individual steps, how each part of the assembly interacts with the next. John felt a spark of realization. He hadn't been thinking small enough. He had been trying to find one big problem that could be solved in one sweeping change. But efficiency wasn't always about fixing one thing. It was about optimizing each step, no matter how minor. John nodded, a plan starting to form in his mind. I think I know what to do. Jake smiled, his expression filled with encouragement. You've got this, man. Just take it one step at a time. The next several hours passed in a blur as John focused on the minutiae of the assembly line. He broke down each individual task, from the way the machines handled materials to how the workers interacted with them. He realized that small adjustments in the timing of each step, moving workers to different positions or recalibrating machines slightly, could eliminate tiny delays that added up over time. By the end of the day, John had come up with a set of recommendations that, while not earth-shattering, could improve the line's efficiency by a few percentage points. It wasn't a revolutionary solution, but it was a practical one. He sent the proposal to Sarah, feeling a mix of nervousness and pride. This was it. There was no going back. The following morning, Sarah called him into her office. John's heart pounded as he stepped inside. "You submitted your report," she said, glancing at her screen. "Let's take a look." John held his breath as she scrolled through his recommendations. Every second felt like an eternity. He waited for her to find something wrong, something that would prove he wasn't good enough. After what felt like a lifetime, Sarah looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "You did well," she said simply. John felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Really?" "Yeah," Sarah continued. "It's not a groundbreaking solution, but it's thoughtful, practical. I can see you've been paying attention. You've got potential, John." John's chest swelled with pride. This wasn't a grand victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. And more importantly, it was a moment of validation. For the first time, he felt like he had truly earned his place at Tesla. John woke up the following morning feeling a rare sense of calm. The anxiety he had once carried around like a constant shadow had begun to fade. It wasn't that everything was perfect, or that he had figured everything out, but he had passed the first real test. And that meant something. It meant that he could keep moving forward. But, as the old saying goes, what comes up must come down. This time, the challenge wasn't just about technical skill or working independently. It was something new. Leadership. John had been on the receiving end of mentorship and support for so long that the idea of becoming the one who would help others seemed completely foreign. But that was exactly what Sarah asked him to do that morning. "John," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I want you to lead a small project. We have a few new recruits joining the program next week, and I think it's time you took on the responsibility of guiding them through the first few days." John's stomach flipped. Leadership? Me? He could barely keep his own head above water half the time. He wasn't sure what Sarah saw in him to make her think he was ready for this. I'm not sure I'm the right person for this," John stammered, the doubt creeping back in like an unwelcome guest. "I've only been here a few weeks." Sarah smiled slightly, as if expecting the hesitation. "You've made incredible progress in a short amount of time. And your experience, the way you've overcome obstacles, it gives you a unique perspective that could really help the new recruits. You don't have to have all the answers, John. You just need to guide them the way you've been guided." John swallowed hard. This wasn't about doing things by the book. It was about showing others what he had learned, both the technical side and the emotional side of surviving and thriving at Tesla. He wasn't sure if he was ready to take that on, but he didn't want to back down. He had to step up, or risk losing everything he'd worked for. "All right," he finally said, though his voice betrayed his nervousness. "I'll do it." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. John was tasked with creating a basic onboarding schedule for the new recruits, helping them get acclimated to the Tesla workspace, and guiding them through the same tasks he had struggled with when he first arrived. It was overwhelming at first. He spent hours revising documents, planning the training schedule, and going over every detail he could think of. The pressure to be perfect weighed on him. He had been the one who needed help only weeks ago. How could he now be the one offering advice and direction? What if he didn't know enough to help them? On the first day the new recruits arrived, John stood in the hallway, waiting for them to arrive, his heart pounding. They filed in, a mix of nervous excitement and confusion on their faces, much like how he had felt when he first walked through those doors. A part of him wanted to reassure them, tell them it would all get easier with time. But another part of him feared that if he didn't do this right, he'd let them, and himself, down. One recruit, a young woman named Jessica, stood out. She had a fire in her eyes, a determination that reminded John of his own drive when he was fighting to survive on the streets. But she also looked a little lost, like she wasn't sure what she had gotten herself into. "All right, everyone," John said, trying to sound confident as he stood at the front of the room, facing the group of new recruits. His voice wavered at first, but he quickly found his rhythm. "Welcome to Tesla. I know this place can be overwhelming, but don't worry. We're all in this together, and we're here to help each other succeed." He looked over at Jessica, who had raised her hand. "What's the hardest part of working here?" she asked. John paused. He hadn't expected the question to hit him so hard. What was the hardest part? The long hours? The constant pressure? The fear of failure? "The hardest part is learning how to keep going even when it feels like you can't," John said, his voice steady now. "There will be times when it feels impossible. There will be days when you feel like giving up, but you have to push through those moments. You have to keep learning, even from your mistakes. The words surprised even him. They were the same words that Jake had said to him weeks ago. They were the same words that had kept him from giving up. And now, he was sharing them with someone else. The first few days went better than John expected. Jessica and the others were eager to learn, and John found himself falling into a rhythm of mentoring. He showed them how to troubleshoot the machines, how to troubleshoot their own doubts, and how to deal with failure without letting it define them. There were moments when he stumbled, when he wasn't sure how to explain something, or when he felt too overwhelmed to keep up. But in those moments, he remembered what Sarah had told him. He didn't have to have all the answers. He just had to guide them, just like someone had guided him. By the end of the first week, the new recruits were starting to hit their stride. John had watched as Jessica and the others gained confidence, figured out their own solutions, and even helped each other. For the first time, he saw how his own journey had come full circle. He was no longer the one asking for help. Now, he was the one giving it. But just as John began to settle into his new role, a new challenge emerged, a challenge that would test not just his technical abilities, but his leadership. The assembly line was facing a major disruption due to a technical issue that no one could immediately resolve. Machines were malfunctioning, and the production line was at risk of falling behind. Everyone was scrambling, including Sarah and the senior engineers, trying to find the root cause. John, caught up in the chaos, found himself thinking back to the first time he'd seen a machine fail. Back then, he had felt like an outsider, someone who didn't belong, someone who couldn't fix things. But now, standing amidst the panic, John felt something else, a sense of calm. He wasn't the one panicking anymore. He turned to Jessica and the others. "We've got this," he said, his voice clear and authoritative. "Let's break this down, piece by piece. We can fix this if we work together." For the first time, John felt the weight of leadership fully settle on his shoulders. It wasn't about being the smartest person in the room. It wasn't about knowing all the answers. It was about staying calm, thinking critically, and trusting the team to pull through. He wasn't just solving the problem. He was leading his team through it. After hours of troubleshooting and hard work, the issue was finally resolved. The machines were back online, and the line was running smoothly again. John stood there, breathing a sigh of relief, his team standing proudly beside him. It wasn't just a technical victory, it was a victory of leadership. Sarah came over, a rare smile on her face. "Well done, John. You stepped up when it mattered most." John couldn't help but smile. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like an imposter. He had earned this role, just like he had earned his place at Tesla. And for the first time, he could see a future where he wasn't just surviving, but thriving. John's newfound sense of confidence didn't last long. As with any journey toward success, just when things seemed to be moving smoothly, a new obstacle appeared on the horizon. A storm that would test everything he had learned so far. It began subtly. A mistake here, a missed deadline there. Nothing too major, but the small cracks started to appear. Production numbers were starting to dip. Some of the new recruits, despite the progress they'd made, were struggling to keep up with the demands of the job. And even though John had done his best to guide them, there were moments when he felt like he was losing control. One of the biggest challenges came in the form of Jessica. Her enthusiasm had been a driving force in the early days, but lately, she had seemed distracted, distant, and less engaged. She had made a few mistakes on the assembly line, and John noticed her frustration growing. It wasn't like her to shy away from challenges. John had tried to talk to her, but she had brushed him off. "I'm fine," she had said, her voice tight. "Just a little off today." But John knew something wasn't right. Her performance was slipping, and that was starting to affect the rest of the team. When one person struggles, it ripples through the entire group. The pressure was mounting, and it felt like the weight of it all was starting to crush him. It was late on a Thursday afternoon when John got the call. The team was working overtime to make up for lost time, and everyone was running on fumes. His eyes were heavy from staring at screens all day, his hands sore from the repetitive motions of adjusting machinery. But it wasn't the exhaustion that got to him. It was the call from Sarah. "John, I need you to come to my office," she said, her voice curt. "It's about Jessica." John's heart dropped. Something in her tone told him this wasn't just another routine check-in. He excused himself from the team and made his way to Sarah's office, his stomach twisted in knots. When he walked in, Sarah was already sitting behind her desk, her hands folded neatly on the surface. But her expression was serious, not the usual friendly demeanor he had grown accustomed to. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. John sat, his mind racing. What happened? Is Jessica okay? Sarah didn't immediately respond. She just looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing her words carefully. Finally, she spoke. "Jessica's been struggling," she said. "She's been underperforming for the last few days. And I've noticed she's not the only one. The team is starting to slip. Production numbers are falling, and I'm concerned that it's not just a technical issue. It's something deeper." John felt a pang of guilt. He had been so focused on his own growth and the progress of the other recruits that he had failed to notice just how much Jessica was struggling. He had assumed that if he kept pushing, kept mentoring, she'd find her footing. But that wasn't always how things worked. "I know she's been under a lot of pressure," John said, trying to defend his teammate. "But we've been doing our best to help her." "I didn't think it was this bad." Sarah nodded, but there was no warmth in her expression. "Sometimes, the pressure can build without anyone realizing it. And when it does, it can take people down in ways we don't expect. I'm worried that if we don't address this soon, it'll have a bigger impact on the whole team." John swallowed hard. He had always prided himself on being a problem solver, someone who could rise to the occasion. But this wasn't a machine that needed fixing. This was a person, someone who had been through a lot already and now was struggling under the weight of expectations. "I need you to talk to her," Sarah said. "See if you can get through to her. I think she trusts you, and maybe you're the only one who can help her understand what's happening before it spirals out of control." The next morning, John found Jessica alone in the break room. Her back was hunched as she stared into her coffee cup, looking far older than her years. The bright spark that had been there when she first arrived was gone, replaced by a heaviness in her eyes that John couldn't ignore. He hesitated for a moment, unsure how to approach her, but he knew that if he didn't say something now, it might be too late. "Hey," he said softly, sitting down across from her. "How's it going?" She didn't look up. "It's fine. Everything's fine," she replied, though the words lacked conviction. John could tell she wasn't fine, and his heart went out to her. He had been in her shoes once, feeling like everything was falling apart, but not knowing how to fix it or even where to start. "Listen, Jessica," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I know things have been tough lately, but you're not alone in this. We're all here for you." She finally met his gaze, her eyes red-rimmed. "It's just, I don't know if I'm cut out for this," she whispered. "I don't know if I can do this anymore." John felt a lump form in his throat. He had heard that voice before, the voice of someone who had lost faith in themselves, who was drowning in doubt. He couldn't let her go down that road. "You are cut out for this," he said, his voice stronger now. "You've proven that already. You got this job because we all saw something in you. I saw something in you. I know it's hard right now, but that doesn't mean you can't get back on track. It's okay to struggle. It's okay to feel like you're failing, but that doesn't mean you give up. You can get through this." Jessica's face crumpled, and John saw the vulnerability she had been hiding. She wasn't just struggling with the job. She was struggling with everything. Expectations, self-doubt, pressure to succeed. He had been there. He knew how that felt. "I don't know if I can do it anymore, John," she said, her voice trembling. I'm not good enough." John reached across the table and gently placed a hand on hers. "You are more than good enough. You're stronger than you think. We all go through tough times. It's how we get through them that matters. And we're going to get through this together. We're a team. And if you need help, you ask. Don't carry this weight alone." For a long moment, they sat in silence. John could see the struggle in Jessica's eyes, but there was also a flicker of something else. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe that things could get better. Later that afternoon, John found himself walking through the Tesla campus, reflecting on what had just happened. The conversation with Jessica hadn't fixed everything, but it had been a start, and sometimes that was all it took. Just a single moment where someone believed in you when you couldn't believe in yourself. It was a long road ahead, for Jessica and for the team. But John felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just here to fix machines or to impress anyone. He was here to help others, just like he had been helped. He wasn't alone anymore. And neither was Jessica. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The next few weeks felt like a blur for John. What had started as a journey of self-improvement had quickly escalated into a full-on battle for survival, not just for him, but for the entire team. Tesla's pressure to meet production goals was relentless, and every mistake seemed amplified. Every setback felt like a threat to their success. The expectations were high, and the stakes were even higher. And now, with Jessica's struggles still lingering, John found himself questioning whether he had what it took to keep everyone on track. Jessica had started to show signs of improvement after their conversation, but her confidence remained fragile. Despite John's best efforts, it was clear that the pressure of the job was still weighing heavily on her, and the cracks in the team were beginning to show. But there was something more to it, something John couldn't quite put his finger on. It wasn't just the pressure from the job itself. It was the pressure to perform, to meet the standards set by higher-ups like Sarah, who had become more distant in recent weeks as her own responsibilities seemed to grow. John had never seen Sarah in a state of real stress before, but now, he could feel the tension radiating off her whenever they met. It was as if the weight of the company's expectations had consumed her, and now it was being passed down to everyone else. The work was hard, the hours were long, and the stress was starting to get to everyone. But it wasn't just the technical problems they were facing. It was something more intangible. It was the feeling that, no matter how hard they worked, it might never be enough. John sat in his cubicle late one evening, staring at his computer screen. The usual hum of the assembly line had quieted, and most of the office had cleared out for the night. But John, along with a handful of others, was still grinding away, trying to make up for the lost time. His eyes were dry from staring at screens, his body exhausted from the never-ending cycle of work. He was beginning to wonder how much longer he could keep this up. It was then that he got a message from Jessica. "Can we talk? I need to tell you something." John immediately felt a sense of unease. He had noticed that Jessica had been quieter lately, but he hadn't thought much of it. Now, with her reaching out to him, he couldn't help but worry that things were about to take another turn for the worse. He texted back, "Of course. Let's meet in the break room in 10 minutes. When John walked into the break room, Jessica was already sitting at the table, her hands nervously wringing a napkin. She looked up as he entered, her face pale and tight with anxiety. "What's going on?" John asked, sitting down across from her. "You okay?" Jessica shook her head, her eyes welling up with tears. I don't know how to say this, but I think I'm going to have to quit." John's heart sank. "What? Why?" "I just can't keep up anymore," Jessica said, her voice cracking. "I've tried, John. I've really tried. But the pressure is just too much. I don't know what happened to me, but I feel like I'm losing everything. I thought I could do this, but I was wrong." John's mind raced. He had never expected to hear this. They had both come so far since the beginning. They had made it through the rough patches together. How could she give up now? "I don't want you to quit," John said, his voice firm but gentle. "We've all been there. We've all felt like we couldn't do it. But you don't have to go through this alone. You don't have to give up." Jessica wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "You don't understand. It's not just about the work. It's everything. I feel like I'm losing myself in all of this. I used to have a life outside of work. I used to have friends. But now, I don't know who I am anymore." John sat back, taking a deep breath. He had been so focused on fixing the problems in the company, in the machines, that he hadn't really stopped to think about what this job was doing to him and to his friends. The constant grind, the long hours, the feeling that nothing was ever enough. It wasn't sustainable. They were all burning out. "You're not losing yourself," John said softly. "But I get it. It's hard. This place is demanding, and sometimes it feels like everything else falls by the wayside. But you can't let it consume you. You've got to find a balance, Jessica. Work hard, but not at the cost of who you are." Jessica's eyes flickered with uncertainty. I don't know if I can. Maybe this just isn't the right place for me. John leaned forward, looking her straight in the eye. Maybe. Or maybe you just need a little time to figure things out. But don't make any big decisions when you're feeling this low. Give yourself some space. We're all in this together, okay? For a long moment, Jessica just stared at him, her face still filled with doubt and fear. But then, slowly, she nodded. Okay, she whispered. I'll think about it. John breathed a sigh of relief, though a part of him still felt uneasy. The pressure wasn't just taking a toll on Jessica, it was taking a toll on all of them. They were all running on fumes, pretending that everything was fine when, in reality, the system was beginning to crack. As John left the break room, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was about to break, something bigger than just Jessica. He saw it in the eyes of the people around him, in the way they worked harder, faster, but with less enthusiasm. They were starting to burn out, just like Jessica. And then, just as he was heading back to his cubicle, he received a message from Sarah. John, can you come to my office? I need to talk to you. John hesitated. The last time Sarah had called him to her office, it had been about the team's performance. Was this another conversation about the pressure? About Jessica? When he walked into her office, Sarah was standing by the window, looking out at the factory floor below. She turned to face him as he entered, her face a mix of concern and frustration. We need to talk, Sarah said, her voice tight. I'm getting pressure from the upper management about the numbers. They're not where they need to be, and they want results. Yesterday, John felt the weight of the conversation sink in. This wasn't just about Jessica. This was about the whole team, about him. And now the pressure was coming from every direction. He had thought things were tough before, but now it felt like the walls were closing in. I know, John said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. We're doing everything we can. Sarah shook her head. It's not enough, John. Not anymore. If we don't meet these targets, things are going to get ugly. The company won't tolerate failure. And neither will I. John's heart pounded. He knew this was the moment that would define everything. The moment where he would either rise to the challenge or fall apart. Then let's do it, John said, his voice calm, but resolute. We'll fix this. Together. Sarah gave him a hard look, studying him. I hope so. I really do. As John walked out of her office, the weight of the situation settled over him like a heavy fog. There was no turning back now. The stakes had never been higher. He couldn't afford to fail. Not for himself, not for Jessica, and not for the team. But as he walked down the hallway toward his desk, he couldn't help but wonder, how much longer could they keep this up? The tension was palpable in the office the following morning. It seemed like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to give. Production numbers were in, and they weren't where they needed to be. Not even close. The team had been working harder than ever, but the pressure to meet corporate demands was mounting faster than anyone could keep up with. John walked into the break room early that day, hoping for a moment of solitude before the storm hit. He was already running on empty, barely sleeping the past few nights. Between overseeing the team, supporting Jessica, and trying to meet the demands of Sarah and upper management, he felt like a juggler with too many balls in the air. The problem was, some of those balls were about to hit the ground. He was the first one there, and for a brief moment, the silence was a relief. He stood by the coffee machine, trying to gather his thoughts when his phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah. John, come to my office. Now. His stomach tightened. This couldn't be good. He had a sinking feeling that this would be the moment when everything either fell apart or changed for the better. He took a deep breath, set his cup down, and walked toward Sarah's office. When he entered, Sarah didn't even look up from the reports she was studying. The stress in her posture was obvious, her back tense, and her brow furrowed. She looked up after a moment, her eyes meeting his with a seriousness that John hadn't seen before. Sit down, John, Sarah said, motioning to the chair in front of her desk. He took a seat, steeling himself for whatever was coming next. He had braced himself for this moment for days, knowing the pressure had been building. But he had hoped it wouldn't come to this. I've been reviewing the latest numbers, Sarah began. We're not where we need to be. The upper management is breathing down my neck, and they want results. Yesterday, John nodded, already feeling the weight of the situation. I know. We've been pushing as hard as we can. But it's not just about hitting numbers. It's about maintaining quality, keeping the team intact. Sarah let out a sigh and leaned back in her chair. You're right. I know that. But the reality is, we're in a high-stakes game here. And I need you to step up. John's chest tightened at her words. It wasn't just a request. It was an expectation. The same kind of expectation he had seen in his father's eyes when he had been growing up. The kind that made him feel like he could never be enough, no matter how hard he tried. I am stepping up, he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. But I can't do it alone. The team needs support, not just in terms of work, but emotionally. People are starting to crack under the pressure. Sarah's gaze softened, but only slightly. I know. And I've been giving you the resources you need, haven't I? John hesitated before responding. You've given me tools, Sarah, but the tools can't fix people. The team is burning out, and I can't keep pushing them like this without things falling apart. I can't keep ignoring what's happening to them. The silence that followed was thick, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice quieter. I didn't want to admit this, John, but you're right. We're all feeling it. This pace, it's unsustainable. But what choice do we have? The company is demanding results. If we fail here, it's not just the team that will suffer. It'll be me. It'll be you. And I can't lose you. John's heart sank at the vulnerability in Sarah's voice. It was the first time he'd heard her speak without the usual layers of control, the ironclad leadership persona. She was feeling it too. They all were. You won't lose me, Sarah, he said, trying to offer some reassurance. But we need to find a way to balance all this. We can't keep pushing people to the brink. The stress is getting to us. She nodded slowly, her eyes distant as if she were thinking through everything he had just said. I don't know how much longer we can keep it up either, John. But I can't just back off now. I need you to push the team harder, get them focused. I need results, and I need them now. John's jaw tightened. It was clear that Sarah was caught in a bind, torn between corporate demands and the well-being of the team. But in that moment, he realized something crucial. He was in the same situation. It wasn't just about the company's success. It was about his success, too. Sarah, we can do this, John said after a long pause. But we need a shift. It's not just about cranking out numbers. We need to build a foundation here. Something sustainable. We need to support each other, not just compete against each other. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, he saw a flicker of hope. But it quickly faded. We don't have time for that right now, John. The numbers don't wait. And with that, the conversation ended. John left Sarah's office with a heavy heart. The pressure was building, and it wasn't just coming from Sarah or the company. It was coming from inside himself. That evening, after a grueling day on the floor, John found himself staring out the window of his small apartment, reflecting on everything that had transpired. Jessica's face kept flashing in his mind. The fragility, the doubt. Her struggle was a mirror for his own. Everyone on the team was in some form of crisis. Whether it was burnout, self-doubt, or the weight of expectations, they were all carrying invisible burdens. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Jessica. I've decided I'm going to stay. John couldn't help but smile. She was still struggling, but she hadn't given up. That small victory felt like a sign. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone in this fight. Maybe there was still a way forward. His phone buzzed again. A notification. The production numbers for the day were in, and they were still below target. The message came with a simple phrase, "Do better tomorrow." John closed his eyes and let out a deep breath. The storm wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The following morning, John woke up earlier than usual, the weight of the previous day's conversations still lingering in his mind. As he made his coffee, his eyes kept drifting to the small, framed photo on the counter, his family, his mom and dad, standing proudly beside him at his high school graduation, all smiles and hope for the future. He had always promised them he would make something of himself. But now, in this moment, he wasn't sure what that something was anymore. He had spent the last few days navigating the growing divide between his loyalty to his team and the demands of the company. Every time Sarah asked for results, every time the upper management pushed harder for numbers, John felt like he was being pulled in two directions. And the people who were relying on him, Jessica, the team, were the ones paying the price. He texted Jessica that morning to check in. She had decided to stay, but John knew the pressure on her hadn't just disappeared overnight. "How are you holding up?" Her response came quickly. "It's tough, but I'm not giving up. Thanks for talking to me the other night." John smiled at the message, grateful that Jessica had chosen to stay in the game. But deep down, he couldn't help but wonder, for how long? The day started with a meeting in the conference room. John walked in, trying to put on his best face, despite the exhaustion weighing on him. The table was full of senior managers, Sarah, and a few representatives from upper management, all staring at a large projection screen displaying the company's numbers, well below expectations. "Let's cut to the chase," said a sharp voice from the end of the table. It was Anthony, the VP of operations, who had flown in from corporate headquarters. His tone was cold, calculating, and devoid of empathy. "We've given you enough time to turn things around, but the numbers don't lie. The pressure is on. We need results, and we need them now." John clenched his jaw as he glanced around the room. Sarah was sitting at the head of the table, visibly tense. She was trying to mask her frustration, but it was clear that Anthony's words were hitting her hard. She didn't like being put on the spot, and neither did John. But this wasn't just a business discussion. It was personal. "We're doing everything we can," Sarah responded, her voice tight. "We've been pushing the team, giving them the tools they need, and focusing on quality as well as production. But we're also human. The team is feeling the pressure." Anthony didn't seem moved. "Human or not, the results aren't there. You're running out of time, Sarah. And John, I need you to step up. This project is in your hands now. If you don't meet the numbers by the end of the week, I'll have no choice but to pull the plug on this whole operation." John's stomach churned at the words. The project, his team, his work, everything, was on the line. He knew that, but hearing it spoken out loud felt like a punch to the gut. The weight of the responsibility, the pressure to succeed, had never felt more suffocating. "I understand," John replied, trying to steady his voice. "We'll get it done. We won't let you down." The meeting ended quickly after that, but the words hung in the air like a dark cloud. The next few days would be critical. John knew he couldn't afford to fail, but as he left the conference room, his mind raced with doubt. Later that afternoon, John gathered the team for a meeting. He needed to address the pressure head-on. Everyone was exhausted, and the last thing they needed was more stress. But they had to push through. The stakes were too high. "All right, everyone, listen up," he began, standing in front of the whiteboard, trying to sound confident despite the uncertainty he felt. "We've got one shot at this. The numbers from the last few days have been rough, but I know we can turn this around. We've been doing things the hard way, but that stops now. I need you to trust me." Jessica was sitting near the front, her face tired but determined. She locked eyes with John, and for a moment, he saw something in her expression that reminded him of why he had taken this job in the first place. The desire to succeed, to build something meaningful, to make a difference. It was the same reason he had joined the team, the same reason they all had. But as he scanned the rest of the room, he saw the signs of burnout in their eyes. Half-empty coffee cups, slumped shoulders, the occasional yawn. They were pushing themselves to the brink, and he couldn't help but wonder how much longer they could keep it up. "Listen," John continued, "I know things are tough, but we're a team, and we're going to pull through together. I've spoken to Sarah, and we're going to get the resources we need to make this work. But we all need to stay focused, and we need to take care of each other. No one gets left behind." The room was quiet for a moment, and then Sarah spoke up, her voice calm but firm. "John's right. We're in this together, and I'll make sure you have the support you need to get through this." A faint sense of relief seemed to spread through the room at her words. The team needed reassurance, not just from John but from Sarah as well. It was her way of showing that, despite the corporate demands, she wasn't going to abandon them. After the meeting, John took a moment to check in with Jessica. She was lingering by her desk, staring at her screen, looking like she was in deep thought. "Hey," John said, approaching her. "How's it going?" Jessica looked up and smiled weakly. I'm holding up. Just taking things one step at a time. John nodded. I know it's not easy, but we're close. I can feel it. I know, she said, her voice quieter now. I'm just scared that, if we don't make it, everything we've worked for will just fall apart. John's heart ached for her. He could see how much this meant to her, how much it meant to all of them. But he also knew that they couldn't keep going at this pace forever. They needed a break, a moment of clarity. Jessica, we're going to make it, John said, trying to offer her some comfort. But we also need to look out for each other. If we need to step back, we will. No one's going to burn out on my watch. She gave him a small nod, but the doubt was still there, lingering in her eyes. I hope you're right. Later that evening, John sat in his office, staring at the numbers on the screen. He had spent hours reviewing the data, searching for a way to hit the targets they needed. But all he saw were gaps, areas where they were falling short. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. They were on the brink of failure. His phone buzzed, and he saw a text from Sarah. John, we need to talk. It wasn't a request, it was an order. John's heart sank. He knew what was coming. Sarah was about to put more pressure on him. But this time, he wasn't sure he could take much more. The next morning came too quickly. John barely slept, his mind racing through the endless scenarios that could unfold. He had always believed that with enough effort, dedication, and teamwork, things could improve. But as the deadline loomed closer, his optimism was starting to crack under the weight of relentless demands. He arrived at the office early, hoping to get a jump on the day. The empty building felt like a silent reminder of the pressure he was carrying. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an unflattering glow on the cold, sterile space. The hum of the coffee machine was the only sound that greeted him, offering a small comfort amidst the storm that was brewing. His phone buzzed again. It was Sarah. Meet me in my office. Now, John's stomach twisted. He knew what was coming. They were in the final stretch now, and if he didn't come up with a solution, he would be the one to fall on the sword. He took a deep breath, grabbed his coffee, and made his way down the long hallway toward Sarah's office. When he entered, Sarah was already sitting at her desk, her face tight with strain. She was looking over the same numbers he had seen the night before, and she looked up only briefly when he walked in. Sit down, John, she said, her voice low, but not angry, just tired. He took a seat across from her, the weight of the conversation already pressing down on him. There was no need for pleasantries now. The situation had escalated beyond that. We've hit a wall, haven't we? John asked, already knowing the answer. He had been watching the numbers fall for days now, and there was no quick fix. Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at the screen in front of her, rubbing her temples as if the very thought of more numbers was physically painful. John, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been going over the figures all morning. The numbers are even worse than I thought. I don't know what else to do. We're out of time. If we don't meet the targets by the end of today, we'll be out of a job. And this entire project could be scrapped. Everything we've worked for, her words trailed off. John's heart sank, and for the first time since taking this job, he felt utterly helpless. He had never been one to give up. But right now, all he could see were insurmountable obstacles. The team was worn out. The numbers weren't improving. And no matter how much they pushed, they just couldn't get the results they needed. The pressure had become too much for everyone. I don't know how much longer we can keep this up, Sarah, he said, his voice cracking with frustration. The team is burned out. They're working at 110%, and it's still not enough. You've seen it. They're cracking. They don't have the energy left for one more push. Sarah looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, John thought she might say something to reassure him, to tell him that they would find a way through it. But instead, she just nodded. I know, she said quietly. I've seen it too. But we don't have any other options, John. I don't know what to tell them anymore. John's mind raced. He had always been the one to find solutions, to make things work. But this time, the puzzle pieces just wouldn't fit together. His gaze shifted to the window, where the early morning light filtered through, casting long shadows on the floor. Outside, the world kept moving, oblivious to the collapse that was happening inside these walls. I can't do this anymore, Sarah, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't keep pushing people beyond their limits. We're going to lose everything if we keep going like this. Sarah's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, the weight of the situation seemed to lift from her shoulders. She leaned back in her chair and sighed, rubbing her eyes. I know, John. I know. But I also know we've come too far to quit now. The company expects results. If we can't deliver, they'll shut us down, and I'll be the one to take the fall. John sat in silence, the weight of her words hanging in the air. He had always admired Sarah for her strength and leadership, but now he could see the cracks in her armor. She was just as broken as the rest of them. After a long pause, Sarah stood up from her desk and walked over to the window, staring out at the city below. You know, when I took this position, I thought I could handle anything. But this, she shook her head. I didn't realize how much it would take from me, how much it would take from all of us. John stood up too, feeling the heavy burden of the moment. He wanted to comfort her, but he wasn't sure how. He wasn't sure if he could even comfort himself. I don't want to give up on the team, he said finally, breaking the silence. I don't want to let them down. Sarah turned back toward him, her face etched with exhaustion but also determination. Neither do I, John. But we have to make a decision. Do we push through the pain and risk breaking everyone? Or do we pull back and risk everything else? The decision weighed on John for the rest of the morning. As the clock ticked down to the final hours before the deadline, he could feel the tension rising within him, squeezing his chest like a vice. His team was on the edge, and he didn't know what the right choice was anymore. There was no good option. Around noon, John gathered the team in the conference room for one last meeting before the final push. The energy in the room was palpable, nervous glances exchanged, tired sighs, and the sense that everyone knew this was the moment that would determine everything. I don't know what's going to happen in the next few hours, John began, his voice steady, but with a tinge of doubt. But I need you all to understand that I appreciate everything you've done. You've been working harder than anyone could ask for. And no matter what happens, I'll never forget this. You've all given your best. The team looked at him, their expressions weary but grateful. Even Jessica, who had been so uncertain in recent days, gave him a small, reassuring smile. It wasn't much, but it was something. Whatever happens, we'll stick together, John continued, his words taking on a tone of resolve. If this is the end of this project, we move on. But we do it as a team. For a moment, there was silence. Then, to his surprise, one of the newer team members, Mark, spoke up. We've been through worse, right? He said, his voice carrying a strange optimism. We've fought through tight deadlines before. I mean, we've all done the impossible before. Why stop now? John felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they still had something left in them after all. The rest of the day passed in a blur. The final numbers were crunched. The reports were prepared. And at the end of it all, when the clock struck 5, John stood before the team with his heart in his throat. It was over. The results were in. But as he opened the email from upper management, a strange, surreal feeling washed over him. The numbers weren't great. They were still below target. But something unexpected had happened, something no one had anticipated. The email contained a brief message. We're extending the deadline. This project has potential, but it needs more time and resources. We're giving you another chance to prove your worth. John felt his knees go weak. It wasn't the triumphant victory he had hoped for, but it was enough. They had bought themselves time. But in that moment, he knew. Nothing was ever going to be the same again. This had been their final test. And now, it was up to them to prove they had the strength to carry on. The news that the deadline was extended came as a relief, but it wasn't the kind of relief that made the weight of the situation vanish. John felt like he was breathing for the first time in days, but it was a shallow breath, a fragile hope that could just as easily be crushed by the next round of demands. The team was silent after the announcement, their faces still worn and tired, but something had shifted. The sense of finality, the feeling that they were on the edge of disaster, was replaced with a flicker of possibility. It wasn't much, but it was enough to spark something in them. They had been given a second chance. They owed it to themselves, to each other, to make it count. John watched as the team began to process the news. Mark, the younger member who had spoken up earlier, cracked a smile. It was small, but it carried with it a sense of determination that John hadn't seen in him before. Jessica, too, seemed to breathe a little easier, her shoulders loosening slightly as if the tension had been released, if only for a moment. Still, they couldn't afford to waste the time they had. As much as John wanted to let the team take a break, to allow them to recharge and recover, there was no time for that. The extension was a lifeline, not a guarantee of success. They had to prove themselves. That night, as John sat in his office going over the new timeline, his phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "John, I need to see you. We need to strategize." John stood up, stretching the stiffness from his back. It had been a long day, and though he was exhausted, he knew he had to keep going. He grabbed his jacket and headed down the hallway to Sarah's office. Sarah was already seated, staring at her computer screen when John entered. She didn't look up right away, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, as if she was weighing her next move. Finally, she sighed and looked up. "I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this, John," she said quietly. "The pressure from corporate is only going to get worse. This extension is a chance, but it's also a ticking clock. They expect results, and if we don't deliver soon, they'll pull the plug on us for good." John could feel the frustration in Sarah's voice, a tone he hadn't heard from her before. She was the one who always seemed to have a plan, the one who knew how to handle pressure. But now, it was clear that even she was beginning to feel the strain. "We'll get it done," John said, trying to offer reassurance, though his own confidence was waning. "We have to. We have the time now. We just need to figure out how to make the most of it." Sarah nodded, but didn't look entirely convinced. She looked down at the stack of reports on her desk, as if searching for answers in the numbers. "We need a new approach," she said finally. "This isn't about just working harder. The team is already at their breaking point. We need to think smarter, work more efficiently. We need to focus on quality, not just quantity." John agreed. They had been grinding away, chasing numbers and results, but they had lost sight of the bigger picture. The team's well-being, their morale, had to come first. If they didn't get that right, all the work would be for nothing. "I think we should prioritize the most critical tasks," John suggested. "Let's break things down, focus on what really moves the needle, and let the rest go. We can't afford to spread ourselves too thin anymore." Sarah leaned back in her chair, considering his suggestion. She hadn't voiced it, but John knew she was starting to realize the same thing. They needed a shift in strategy, or they would burn out trying to do everything. "Okay," Sarah said, her voice firming with resolve. "Let's do that. Let's figure out what really matters, what we can do to make the most impact with the least amount of effort. It's going to be a tough road, but we have a chance, and we're going to take it." The next morning, John gathered the team for a meeting to outline the new approach. They had been given a second chance, but they couldn't waste it. Time was still against them. "We're going to work smarter, not harder," John began, his tone upbeat despite the heaviness of the situation. "We've been spread too thin, so it's time to focus on what really matters. We're going to identify the highest impact tasks and pour all of our energy into those. We can't keep doing everything and expecting results." Jessica nodded, a look of determination crossing her face. John could see that she was ready for the challenge. She had been the one to doubt them the most, but now, she seemed to have found a new sense of purpose. "We're going to split up into smaller groups," John continued. "Each group will take ownership of a specific task. You'll have more control over how it's done, and we'll be able to move faster. This isn't about working longer hours or burning out. It's about working with precision." The team seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. They had been drowning under the weight of endless tasks, and now they were going to focus on what truly mattered. It felt like a shift, like they were finally taking control. As the meeting ended, John felt a new energy in the room. It wasn't much, but it was something. They had a plan, and now they just had to execute it. Over the next few days, the team threw themselves into the new strategy. The stress was still there, the pressure still hung over them like a shadow, but something had changed. With the new approach, they felt a sense of agency, a feeling that they weren't just spinning their wheels anymore. They had focus, and that made all the difference. John worked closely with Jessica, helping her prioritize the tasks that would have the greatest impact. It was exhausting, but it felt like they were making progress. Slowly but surely, the numbers began to climb, inching closer to where they needed to be. The sense of urgency never left, but for the first time in a long while, John felt a glimmer of hope. They were fighting back against the odds, against the fatigue and doubt that had almost consumed them. They were doing more than just surviving. They were finding a way to thrive. The last day of the extended deadline arrived. The team was tired, but their determination had carried them through. They had pushed themselves harder than they ever thought possible, but they had also worked smarter, focusing on the tasks that really moved the needle. John stood in the conference room, watching the team finish up their final reports. He could feel the tension in the air. This was it. They had done everything they could. Now, they just had to wait. Sarah arrived, her face unreadable as she sat down at the head of the table. The numbers were on the screen in front of her, and she began reviewing them one last time. "I know we've all given everything we have," Sarah said quietly, "but we can't forget. We've got one last hurdle to clear. If these numbers don't meet expectations, we're out. It's as simple as that." John's heart beat loudly in his chest as the room fell into a heavy silence. They had given everything. Now, it was up to the higher-ups. And then, the email came in. Sarah clicked on the screen. She scanned the message for a few seconds, and then, slowly, a small smile crept across her face. "We did it," she said, barely above a whisper. The room erupted in a cheer, and John felt a wave of relief flood through him. They had made it. They had beaten the odds, turned things around when it seemed impossible. But John knew this victory wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. They had earned their place, but now they had to prove they could sustain it. The relief from their victory didn't last long. The email that confirmed they had met the new deadline was a high point, a moment of triumph. But as the adrenaline started to fade, John could feel the exhaustion creeping back in. The team had done what was needed, but they weren't out of the woods yet. In fact, the hardest part was just beginning. Corporate expectations would only rise. The pressure to deliver would become more intense. And the question lingered in the back of John's mind. Could they keep it up? As the team filed out of the conference room after the big news, John lingered behind, staring at the final report on the screen. It was a relief, yes, but also a reminder. The project wasn't over. The future wasn't guaranteed. There were still clients to manage, targets to hit, and expectations to exceed. He had seen how quickly things could turn on a dime. One mistake, one slip-up, it could all come crashing down. That afternoon, Sarah called him into her office. He had been expecting this meeting, but the weight of it still hung over him like a storm cloud. As he entered, Sarah was already seated at her desk, leaning back in her chair, her eyes focused on the screen. Her face was as impassive as ever, but John could tell there was a storm brewing inside her too. "Sit down, John," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. John took a seat, trying to read her expression. It wasn't anger that he saw in her eyes. No, it was something far more dangerous. Uncertainty. "How are you holding up?" Sarah asked, her voice softer than usual. John paused for a moment, considering the question. "I'm okay," he said. "Tired. But we did it. We actually did it." Sarah nodded, but she didn't look particularly relieved. "Yeah, we did. But now we have to keep doing it. This is just the beginning. If we don't keep pushing forward, everything we've worked for will fall apart." John understood. The victory was hollow unless they could sustain it. And that wasn't going to be easy. "Corporate is already breathing down our necks," Sarah continued, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. "They're already looking ahead, wanting to know how we're going to maintain these numbers, how we're going to scale. There's no celebrating. Not yet. We're not out of the woods. Not by a long shot." John exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the conversation pressing on him. This was what he had feared. Even when they succeeded, it wasn't enough. There was always another hurdle, always another level to reach. And how are we supposed to do that? John asked, a hint of desperation creeping into his voice. "We're already stretched so thin, Sarah. We can't keep up this pace. We're burning out." Sarah's eyes softened. "I know. I feel it too. But there's no other choice. If we don't show them we can deliver consistently, they'll move on to the next team, and we'll be left with nothing. The silence that followed was heavy. John could see it in Sarah's eyes. She was trapped too. She had been leading them through the storm, but now, she didn't know how much more she could take either. For the next few days, the pressure continued to mount. John and Sarah worked tirelessly, trying to formulate a plan that would keep the momentum going. The team was still on edge, worn thin by the constant grind. They were running on fumes, but they couldn't afford to slow down. John found himself staying later and later at the office, poring over reports, analyzing data, and revising strategies. It felt like they were just running in circles, checking the same numbers again and again, hoping for a different outcome. The frustration was palpable, and no one was immune to it. But one evening, as John walked through the nearly empty office, he saw something that stopped him dead in his tracks. It was Jessica, sitting at her desk, eyes wide and unblinking as she stared at the computer screen. She hadn't noticed him yet. He approached her slowly, concern rising in his chest. He had seen the exhaustion in her eyes over the past few days, but this was different. This was something deeper, darker. "Hey," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. "You okay?" Jessica jumped, and for a moment, she looked disoriented, as if she hadn't heard him approach. She quickly shut her laptop, as though hiding something. "I'm fine," she said, forcing a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Just finishing up some work. Nothing to worry about." John wasn't convinced. He had worked with Jessica long enough to know when something was off. "Jessica," he said gently, "you've been pushing yourself hard. I can see it. I think everyone is. But if you need a break, if you need to talk, don't hesitate to reach out." For a long moment, Jessica said nothing. Then, she sighed and leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "I don't know, John," she said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "I just feel like we're never going to get ahead. We keep doing everything we're asked, but it's never enough. The harder we try, the more they expect from us. I'm not sure how much longer I can keep this up." John sat down beside her, offering a sympathetic look. "I get it," he said quietly. "Believe me, I do. But you're not in this alone. None of us are. We'll get through this. We just have to keep looking out for each other." Jessica met his gaze, and for a brief moment, John saw the weight of her fear and uncertainty in her eyes. She wasn't just scared of the project falling apart. She was scared of what would happen if they couldn't keep up the momentum. "I'm just so tired, John," she whispered. "I know," he said, his voice soft but firm. "But we're not giving up. Not yet. And we'll make it through together. All of us." As the days passed, John noticed the toll the pressure was taking on everyone. The team was cracking under the weight, and there wasn't a clear way forward. Everyone was working hard, but the burnout was starting to show. They were doing more than they ever had before, and yet, it still wasn't enough. He spent another long night at the office, staring at the numbers and rethinking the strategy. The old ways weren't working. They needed a breakthrough. Something had to change if they were going to survive, and he had no idea what that something was. The morning of the next meeting, Sarah called him into her office. The weight of the conversation was already hanging between them before she said a word. "We can't keep doing this, John," she said quietly, as though she had already made up her mind. "The team is burning out, and we're barely keeping it together. We need to do something drastic. We need to change the way we work." John felt a pang of hope. For the first time in days, Sarah wasn't just telling him to keep pushing. She was acknowledging the problem. "What do you have in mind?" he asked cautiously. Sarah leaned back in her chair, rubbing her eyes. "We need to take a step back. We need to reevaluate. If we keep pushing forward without a plan, we're going to burn out, and everything will fall apart." John nodded slowly, finally allowing himself to think of something other than the endless grind. Maybe they could find a way to slow down long enough to reset, recharge, and then come back stronger. It wasn't the answer he had been looking for, but it felt like a start. "We'll figure this out," John said, more to himself than to Sarah. "We'll find a way." And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure if they would succeed. But for the first time in a long while, he was willing to try. The days following Sarah's acknowledgement of the team's burnout were some of the most uncertain John had ever experienced. For the first time, There was no clear path forward. They had pushed so hard, given everything they had, and yet, it felt like they were teetering on the edge. Corporate still demanded more, but the team was exhausted. They had no more give left in them. John sat in his office, looking out the window as the city bustled below. It was early morning, and the office was quieter than usual. The team was scattered, some still working on reports, others, like Jessica, taking quiet moments to rest. The pace had slowed, and while that was a relief in some ways, it also made John uneasy. Time was still ticking, and they couldn't afford to fall behind. Sarah was the first to suggest a meeting to reset, though no one really knew what that reset would look like. The team gathered in the conference room, faces tired, eyes circled with dark shadows. The weight of their collective exhaustion hung in the air. Sarah stood at the front of the room, looking more determined than she had in days, but even she seemed to carry the burden of what came next. "We can't keep going like this," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the quiet. "We've done great work, but if we don't change something, we're going to burn out. All of us." There was a murmur of agreement. It was clear that no one was happy with the current state of things. They were all working hard, but it felt unsustainable. They needed to find a way to push forward without pushing themselves into the ground. John stood up, addressing the room. "What we need is a plan, a real one, not just more hours or more work. We need to refocus and prioritize what really matters. We can't do everything, but we can do a few things well." He looked around the room, meeting each person's gaze. "The old way isn't working. We can't just grind away and hope it all falls into place. We need to focus on the high-impact areas, work as a team, and support each other. We need to get back to why we started in the first place." Jessica, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. Her voice was raw but strong. "I think we've lost sight of the bigger picture. Everything's been about just getting it done, but what are we really doing here? Why are we pushing so hard? There's got to be more to this than just meeting numbers." Her words landed in the room like a punch, forcing everyone to pause. They had been so focused on survival, on hitting the next target, that they had forgotten the reason they were here, to build something meaningful, something that would last. John felt the weight of Jessica's words. They were right. They had been running on autopilot for far too long, trying to get through the day instead of looking at the bigger picture. "Maybe it's time we take a step back and remember what we're really doing here," John said. "We're not just employees in a company. We're a team with a goal. We can't keep sacrificing our health, our sanity, for numbers on a page. We need a change." The room fell into silence again, and for the first time in days, John could sense a shift. The team was no longer just reacting to the pressure. They were taking ownership of their situation. Over the next few days, they worked together to form a new strategy. The plan was simple, but it felt like a revelation. Quality over quantity. They would focus on the tasks that truly mattered, the ones that would move the needle the most. And they would support each other along the way, ensuring no one was left to shoulder the burden alone. It wasn't a magical fix. The pressures didn't disappear overnight, but the change in approach was palpable. The team's energy shifted from a place of desperation to one of renewed purpose. They began to take pride in their work again, not because it was easy, but because it felt meaningful. John and Sarah worked closely to restructure the timeline. They allocated time for rest, breaks, and even personal development. They encouraged the team to take moments to recharge, to step away when necessary, and to communicate openly about what was working and what wasn't. One afternoon, John caught up with Jessica during a break. She was sitting at the coffee table, staring into her mug but looking more relaxed than he had seen her in weeks. "How are you holding up?" John asked, taking a seat beside her. Jessica smiled faintly. "Better, actually. I think the change is helping. The team feels different now. We're not just trying to survive anymore. We're actually working together." John nodded. "That's the goal. And if we keep this up, we'll do more than just survive. We'll thrive." She looked at him, her eyes still carrying the weight of the last few weeks. But now there was something more. Hope. "I think we can do it," she said. "We just needed to remember that we're not alone in this." The next few weeks weren't without challenges. There were still moments of doubt, times when the pressure seemed too great. But the team had built something stronger than before, an understanding that they didn't have to carry the burden alone. They were in this together, and that made all the difference. Sarah checked in with the team frequently, ensuring that no one felt isolated or overwhelmed. They had regular feedback sessions where everyone could voice concerns, share progress, and ask for help when needed. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was a far cry from the constant chaos they had been living in. The work began to feel more like a team effort rather than an individual struggle. Mark, who had been quieter in recent weeks, started to open up more. He became more vocal in meetings, offering ideas and feedback. His confidence had returned, and the others followed suit. Even the numbers started to improve, though no one was focusing on them as much. The results came because they had redefined their approach, because they were working smarter, not harder, and focusing on quality over quantity. One afternoon, John and Sarah met in the conference room to discuss the upcoming presentation to corporate. It was an important moment, the chance to show the higher-ups what they had accomplished and how they had turned things around. John felt a mix of excitement and nerves. This was their chance to prove they had what it took to sustain their success. But there was something else he had realized over the past few weeks. Success was no longer just about the results. It was about how they got there, about the lessons they learned and the growth they experienced as a team. As he sat across from Sarah, he smiled. "I think we've come a long way, Sarah." She smiled back, but there was no trace of the exhaustion that had once defined her. She looked calm, confident, ready. "We have, John. And it's not just about getting through the next presentation. It's about how we keep going after that, how we keep improving." The presentation to corporate went better than they could have hoped. The numbers were strong, the results impressive, but it was the story they told that resonated most. They spoke honestly about the challenges they had faced, the burnout, and how they had turned things around. They emphasized teamwork, communication, and resilience. And for the first time, they didn't just feel like they were answering to corporate. They felt like they were sharing a part of themselves. As the meeting ended and the team left the conference room, John looked around at the faces of his colleagues. They were tired, yes, but there was pride in their eyes. They had done something extraordinary, together, and now they were ready for whatever came next. The days following the successful presentation to corporate were some of the calmest the team had experienced in weeks. The pressure hadn't completely lifted, but there was a noticeable shift. Corporate was pleased with their progress, and for once, there was a sense of validation. The team felt like they had proven their worth, not just by meeting expectations, but by rebuilding in a way that was sustainable and, more importantly, human. John, for the first time in a long while, found himself able to breathe. He had learned that success wasn't just about numbers or deadlines. It was about balance, about maintaining your well-being and finding a way to thrive, even when the stakes were high. It was a lesson that, while hard one, had made all the difference. But just as things began to settle into a new rhythm, something unexpected happened. It was a Friday afternoon when the email arrived. John was about to close his laptop for the day, ready to enjoy the weekend with a sense of peace. But the subject line stopped him cold. Opportunity for team lead role. Immediate response required. His stomach flipped. He opened the email, and as he read it, the sense of disbelief only grew. The email wasn't from anyone he recognized, at least, not in his direct company network. It was from someone higher up, someone whose name was known to only a few in the organization. "Dear John," the email began, "we've been following the progress of your team's recent work and are impressed with the turnaround you've managed. We believe that you have the skills and leadership potential to take on a higher responsibility within the company. We're offering you an opportunity to step into a leadership role where you can lead a larger division. We'd like to discuss this further with you at your earliest convenience. Please respond with a time for a brief call." John read the email again, then a third time, still unsure if he was misreading it. It wasn't just any offer. This was a massive step up, a chance to lead not just his team but an entire division. He felt a knot form in his chest. This was a dream come true, but was it too soon? The phone call happened the following Monday. Sarah had already briefed him on the offer, and while she was supportive, she could tell that John was conflicted. The team had just begun to stabilize, and the idea of taking on a much larger role now felt like a huge risk. The call came through around noon. John answered, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice on the other end was calm, confident and slightly familiar. "John, it's Greg Matthews from corporate. How are you today?" John cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves. "I'm doing well, Greg. Thanks for reaching out." "I'll get straight to the point," Greg said without hesitation. "We've been following your work, and we believe that you're the right person to take on a leadership role in the new product division we're launching. The team you've managed to build, the results you've achieved, they've been impressive. You've shown not just results, but the ability to lead and innovate under pressure. We need someone like you to step into this role." John blinked, struggling to process the words. He had dreamed of this moment, but now that it was happening, he felt overwhelmed. That's a huge offer, Greg. But I need to be honest with you. I've only recently gotten my team back on track. I'm not sure if I'm ready for a larger role just yet. I want to make sure my team is solid before I consider moving up." Greg's voice softened, but his tone remained persuasive. "I understand the concern, John, but that's exactly why we're reaching out to you. You've demonstrated resilience and the ability to lead in tough times. We're not asking you to leave your current team behind. We're offering you the chance to build something even bigger, something that can make a significant impact across the company. You'd have support, resources, and a network of leaders behind you. It's a chance to really elevate your career." John paused, feeling the weight of the decision. This was more than just a job change. This was a defining moment in his career. "I'll need some time to think about it," John finally said. "This isn't a decision I can make lightly." Greg's tone shifted, almost understanding. "Of course, take the time you need. But let me just say this. There's a window for this role, and we're hoping you'll consider it seriously. We're looking for someone who can lead us into the next phase of growth, and we believe you're the right person." As the call ended, John sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He wasn't just considering a career move. He was considering the future of his team, his colleagues, and his own personal growth. Could he really take on this new challenge without abandoning the people who had gotten him to this point? Later that day, John called Sarah. He needed to talk it through with someone who understood him, someone who could offer perspective. "I've been offered a leadership role," John said when she picked up. "A big one." Sarah didn't sound surprised. "I figured as much. You've been putting in a lot of work, John. They're noticing." "But I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted. "I've just started rebuilding the team. We've barely gotten back to where we need to be. What if I take this new role and end up leaving them behind? What if I can't keep the balance I've worked so hard for?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Sarah spoke, her voice firm but gentle. "John, you've got to trust yourself. You've already proven you can lead, even when things were at their worst. You've got the ability to balance hard work with compassion. You won't abandon your team. And if you do decide to take this step, you'll have the resources and the people to make it work. But only you can decide if this is the right move for you." John let her words sink in. He knew she was right. He had built a strong foundation, but he still felt uncertain. The question was not just about whether he could take on a larger role. It was about whether he wanted to, and whether it was the right time. "I'll need a little more time," John said, his mind still whirling. "But I appreciate your perspective, Sarah. I'll keep thinking it through." As the days passed, John continued to weigh the offer. He spoke with his team, gathered feedback, and considered the consequences. There were risks, certainly, but the opportunity was enormous. He could help shape the future of the company, build something even bigger than what they had already accomplished. But even with all the advice and input, the decision was ultimately his. In the end, John realized that no decision would come without its challenges. But perhaps, after all they had been through together, he was ready for something bigger. Maybe it was time to step into the unknown, to lead on a broader scale, and to continue growing, not just as a professional, but as a person. The decision had consumed John for the past week. Every conversation, every thought, seemed to circle back to the same dilemma. Should he take the promotion, or should he stay with his team and continue to rebuild what they had worked so hard to restore? It wasn't just about career advancement. It was about legacy. It was about the people who had helped him get to this point, the team that had supported him when everything seemed to be falling apart. He couldn't simply walk away from them. Not now. Not after everything they had been through together. But on the other hand, this offer was too big to ignore. The chance to lead a division, to have a say in the company's direction, was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It was late one evening when Sarah found him sitting alone in the conference room, staring at the offer email once again. She could tell he was deep in thought, a furrowed brow etched across his face. "Still thinking about it?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. John looked up at her, his face a mixture of exhaustion and uncertainty. "Yeah, I can't stop thinking about it. I've been up all night, running through the pros and cons. I know it's a big opportunity, but I don't want to abandon the team. We're just getting back on track. I don't want to throw everything off balance again." Sarah stepped into the room and sat across from him. "You're not abandoning anyone, John. I get where you're coming from. You've put everything into this team, and you've worked your tail off to get us here. But here's the thing. If anyone can handle this new role, it's you. You've already proved you can lead, even under the toughest circumstances. And your team? They're stronger than you think. They're ready to stand on their own now. You've built them up, and they'll keep going." John let out a long breath, trying to process her words. "But what if I'm not there for them? What if they need me and I'm not around?" Sarah smiled gently, her eyes full of understanding. "They'll always need you, but that doesn't mean you can't still support them from a distance. Think about it, John. This role, if you take it, could allow you to do more for the company and for your team than you ever could have imagined. You'll have the influence, the resources, and the opportunity to shape things in ways you couldn't before. You're not just a manager anymore. You're a leader on a bigger scale. And the best part? You don't have to leave anyone behind. You can bring all of us with you." John stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. She was right. The team had grown, and it wasn't just about him anymore. They were ready. They didn't need to be coddled. They needed someone who could help them push further, who could empower them to take on more responsibility and grow in their own right. "But I don't want to make a decision based on fear," John said quietly. "I'm afraid of letting them down. But I also know this opportunity might not come again." Sarah gave him a knowing look. "You're not letting anyone down. You've already proven that. And sometimes, the biggest risks lead to the greatest rewards. Not just for you, but for the people you're leading." For a long moment, there was silence. John's mind raced as he thought about everything Sarah had said. He knew she was right. The team was ready. They were stronger than ever, and he had built a foundation that could sustain itself. But he had to admit, part of him still felt guilty. He had poured so much into this group, and leaving them behind, at least in the capacity he had been in, felt like a betrayal. He leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. Maybe it's time to let go a little. Let them soar on their own. Sarah nodded. "Exactly. And remember, you don't have to go alone. This team has your back, no matter where you go next." John smiled, a weight lifting off his chest. For the first time in days, he felt at peace with the decision. It wasn't going to be easy, but it felt like the right move. It was time to grow, to embrace the challenge of leading a bigger division. And in doing so, he could continue to support his team from a higher vantage point. The next morning, John called Greg Matthews back. His hands were clammy as he dialed the number, and his mind was racing. He had made up his mind, but it still felt like a monumental step. This wasn't just a career change, it was a new chapter in his life. When Greg answered, John's voice was steady. "Hi, Greg. It's John. I've had some time to think about the offer." "I'm glad to hear it, John," Greg replied, his tone warm. "What have you decided?" John paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I've decided to accept the role. I think it's the right time to take the next step." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Greg responded. "I'm glad to hear that, John. We're excited to have you join the new division. You've earned this, and we believe you'll do great things." "Thank you," John said, feeling a mixture of excitement and nerves. "I'm looking forward to getting started." After the call ended, John felt a rush of emotions. Relief, excitement, a little bit of fear, too. But through it all, he knew he had made the right decision. The future was uncertain, but it was his to shape. Later that afternoon, John gathered the team together for a meeting. He knew he needed to share the news, not just because it was professional, but because they had all been through this journey together. They deserved to know what was next for him and for them. The room grew quiet as John stood at the front, his hands resting on the table. He could feel the weight of the moment, the eyes of his team fixed on him. "I have some news to share," John began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I've been offered a new role, one that will take me to a larger division in the company. After a lot of consideration, I've decided to accept it." There were no immediate reactions, just a few glances exchanged between team members. John continued, "I want you all to know that this decision wasn't easy for me. This team means everything to me. But I truly believe that you are all ready for the next step, and I know you'll continue to thrive without me by your side every day. You've all worked so hard, and you've proven that you can do incredible things. You've shown me what you're capable of, and that's why I'm confident in this decision." A silence settled in the room. John watched as Sarah gave him an encouraging nod, and he could see the understanding in her eyes. Slowly, one by one, the team members began to speak. "That's amazing, John," Mark said, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "You've earned it, and we'll be here to support you, just like you've always supported us." Jessica added, "You've led us through the toughest times. We'll be just fine, I promise." John's chest tightened with emotion as he looked at his team. They were ready. They were strong. And though this chapter was ending, another was beginning, not just for him, but for all of them. That evening, as John walked out of the office for the last time as their direct leader, he felt a sense of closure. It wasn't goodbye. It was a new beginning. And he knew that, no matter where he went, the lessons he had learned and the team he had built would always be a part of him. The first day in his new role felt surreal. John woke up early, much earlier than he had in months, feeling the sharp edge of both excitement and nervousness. His new office was far grander than the one he'd had before, with a sweeping view of the city that seemed to mirror the wide-open possibilities that lay ahead. The elevator ride to his floor felt different, like the weight of the building itself was pressing down on him. Everything felt new, every step, every meeting, every email. He took a deep breath as the elevator doors opened. This was it. No going back now. As he walked to his new office, John couldn't help but notice how different it all was. The atmosphere was more formal, the halls more silent. It was a place where decisions were made by higher-ups, a place where everything felt just a little bit more serious. He was no longer a part of a small team fighting to survive. Now, he was in charge of an entire division, tasked with overseeing multiple teams, making critical decisions, and leading projects that would shape the future of the company. As he entered his new office, he was greeted by a team of executives, people he hadn't worked with before, but who now looked to him for guidance. The transition wasn't going to be easy, and it was clear they had expectations. But John wasn't concerned about the pressure. He had faced far worse challenges before. What mattered most now was how he would lead this new team and navigate the challenges that lay ahead. The first few weeks were a blur. Meetings with department heads, strategy sessions, financial reports. It was a whirlwind of information and decision-making. John found himself immersed in the deep complexities of running a larger division. The challenges were different from what he had faced before, but they were just as tough. He quickly realized that leadership at this level wasn't just about managing projects. It was about managing people. It was about understanding their strengths, motivating them, and knowing when to step in and when to let them take the reins. The responsibilities were overwhelming at times, but he relied on the lessons he had learned from his team, the importance of communication, empathy, and trust. In one of his early meetings with the senior leadership team, John shared a vision that he had been working on. "We have a great foundation," he said, standing at the head of the conference table, looking around at the executives who were now looking to him for direction. "But we can't just rest on our laurels. We need to innovate, to push the envelope. We need to be daring, to take calculated risks and make bold moves. That's what will keep us ahead of the competition." There was a brief pause before one of the senior executives, Linda, spoke up. "Bold moves are great, but we need a concrete plan. We can't afford to gamble on untested ideas. We have to ensure our foundation is stable before we branch out." John understood where she was coming from. It was a natural instinct to prioritize stability. But he also knew that without risk, there was no progress. "I hear you, Linda," John replied, his voice steady. "But stability isn't enough to stay competitive. We need to innovate in ways that our competitors haven't thought of yet. The market is changing fast, and we need to be ahead of it. Let's make sure we're not just reacting to trends, but setting them." Linda didn't look convinced, but John could see the others in the room nodding. He knew he wasn't going to win everyone over immediately, but the more he spoke, the more he realized that this was exactly where he needed to be. He wasn't just a cog in the wheel anymore. He was helping shape the direction of the entire division. As the weeks passed, John found himself becoming more comfortable in his new role. He met with team leaders, listened to their concerns, and worked to create a culture of collaboration and openness. His approach to leadership hadn't changed. It was still rooted in trust and empowerment. But now he had more resources at his disposal and more people to support him. However, as he settled into the new role, he also noticed something he hadn't anticipated: the distance that had begun to grow between him and his old team. They were still doing great work, but without his daily presence, things felt different. It wasn't that they were floundering, but there was an underlying tension in the air. The team was used to John's hands-on approach, and now that he was removed from the day-to-day, they were finding their own way. But it was clear they missed his leadership. Sarah, who had been promoted to lead their old team in his absence, sensed it too. One afternoon, she invited him for coffee, and they met at a small cafe around the corner from the office. "Hey," she greeted him with a smile, but there was a hint of concern in her eyes. "How's the new role treating you?" John chuckled. "Busy. It's been a lot to take in, but I'm adjusting. How are things going with the team?" Sarah looked away for a moment before answering. "It's going well. Everyone's adjusting, but I can tell they miss having you around. They're doing great work, but they're a little disoriented. They're not sure where they stand without you here." John felt a twinge of guilt. "I didn't realize it was that hard. I thought they'd be fine by now." "They will be," Sarah assured him. "It's just a transition. You've been such a big part of their growth, John. They need time to adapt to this new structure." He nodded, understanding what she was saying. He had made the right choice in moving up, but that didn't mean the people he cared about weren't still on his mind. "I'll check in with them more," he said. "I don't want them to feel like they've been abandoned." "You're not abandoning them," Sarah said, her voice soft but confident. "You've set them up for success. They just need to find their own rhythm now, and you need to let them. They're ready, John. They're going to surprise you." Despite the challenges, John was finding his footing. He was working to foster innovation, taking risks, and earning the respect of his new team. But he knew the road ahead wasn't going to be without its bumps. The balance between leadership and responsibility was delicate, and every decision had ripple effects. He didn't have the luxury of making mistakes like he used to. But as he looked out from his office window, watching the sunset over the city, John felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what he had worked for. Not just the promotion, but the chance to truly lead. On a bigger stage, with bigger stakes, and with a team that was ready to take on the world. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah. "They're doing great, John. You've got this. I believe in you." He smiled as he typed back, "Thanks, Sarah. I couldn't have gotten here without you. Let's keep pushing forward, together." It had been 6 months since John had transitioned into his new role. The whirlwind of meetings, decisions, and constant strategizing had become his new normal, and he was beginning to see the fruits of his labor. The division was thriving. The projects were on track, and the teams were more innovative than ever. He had made tough calls, some that were met with resistance, some that had earned him praise. But through it all, John felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. Yet, despite the progress, something lingered in the back of his mind. The gap between his old team and him hadn't completely disappeared. They were still succeeding, still making strides, but there was an unspoken distance. John had given them everything they needed to soar, but as their former leader, he was now a distant figure. A figure who no longer hovered in the trenches with them. It wasn't until one afternoon, when he sat down with Sarah for their usual check-in, that he realized how much he missed that old camaraderie. "How's everything going, Sarah?" John asked as they sat down in the conference room, surrounded by data reports and performance charts. He had asked her to come in for an update, but he found himself wanting to hear about the team, about the people who had once been his closest allies. She set down the report and smiled. "We're on track. The numbers look good, and the team is strong. They've really found their rhythm. But, John, her voice softened, they still miss you. Not in a bad way. They just miss your guidance. You know, the day-to-day stuff. John leaned back in his chair, absorbing her words. He had been so focused on leading the new division, on steering the ship through uncharted waters, that he hadn't realized how much his team still relied on his presence, on his mentorship. They had grown, yes, but they were still evolving, still learning. I get that, John said quietly. I thought they'd be fine without me. But I guess I've been so caught up in this new role that I forgot about the importance of just showing up. Sarah looked at him with understanding. It's natural. You're doing great work, John. But you don't have to choose between this new position and them. You can still support them, in a different way. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. John considered this for a long moment. He had spent so many months caught between the pull of his new role and the tug of his old team. But maybe it wasn't about choosing one over the other. Maybe it was about finding a new way to be present, without abandoning the people who had helped him get here. You're right, he said, a sudden clarity washing over him. I've been so focused on the future that I forgot to check in on the present. I'll talk to them. Maybe we need to find a new rhythm together. Later that week, John called a meeting with the old team. The group gathered in the familiar conference room, their faces expectant. John had kept in touch, but this would be the first time in months that he would address them all directly. There was a buzz of quiet conversation as they waited for him to speak. When he entered the room, a sense of nostalgia hit him. These people weren't just colleagues. They were his family, the people who had seen him at his lowest and helped him rise to where he was now. They were the ones who had believed in him, even when he hadn't believed in himself. Hey, everyone, John began, his voice steady but full of emotion. I wanted to check in, not just as your former leader, but as someone who's proud of everything we've accomplished together. He paused, letting the words sink in. The room fell silent. You've all grown so much in the time I've been gone, and I'm incredibly proud of what you've achieved. Sarah, you've done an amazing job leading the team. I can see the strength and resilience in all of you. But I also realize that I've been distant, and that's not fair to you. I've been so caught up in my new role that I haven't been the kind of leader I want to be for you. There was a moment of stillness before Sarah spoke up, her voice soft but firm. John, we've been fine. We've had your support, even if it wasn't always direct. You set us up to succeed, and we've been doing just that. I know, John replied, but I want to be more involved again. I want to help guide you, even from this new role. You're all ready for more, and I can help you get there. But I also want to remind you that I'm still here for you, no matter what. We're still in this together. He looked around the room, meeting each of their eyes. The bond he had once felt so strongly was still there, and in that moment, he knew that he hadn't lost it. They hadn't lost it. He had just needed to find a way to reconnect with them, in a new way. Mark smiled. We'll always be a team, John. No matter where you go or what you do, we've got your back. Jessica added, and we know you'll have ours. John's heart swelled with gratitude. They had grown stronger without him, but they still needed him, and he needed them. It was a humbling realization, and one that reminded him that leadership wasn't about always being in the front. It was about knowing when to step back, when to empower others, and when to step forward and offer support. That afternoon, John walked out of the meeting with a renewed sense of purpose. The decision to move into his new role had been a big one, and it had been filled with its share of doubts and sacrifices. But as he looked around at the faces of the people who had been by his side, he knew he had made the right choice. The challenges weren't over. In fact, they were just beginning. The division was growing, the company was evolving, and the world around him was changing fast. But John felt ready for whatever was next. He had a team that believed in him, and he believed in them. As he sat back at his desk, looking out at the city skyline, John thought about how far they had all come. There was still so much to do, so much to achieve. But for the first time in months, he felt a deep sense of peace. He wasn't just a leader anymore. He was a mentor, a guide, a part of something bigger than himself. And that was enough. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?